I spent most of my life thinking I was a liberal, but the truth of who I am is I'm trans-political. I've been a conservative trapped inside of a liberal's body all this time. Furthermore, they did not let me fly the plane, even though I identified as the pilot. It's possible she identified as a rioter herself, which would mean she was in the same room as a rioter. And when asked his thoughts about his platform using to restrict free speech, he simply responded with a smile. We're all proud of what you've accomplished, you mother zucker.
This is the kind of cutting-edge satire you can expect from JP Sears, a comedian who runs the Awaken with JP YouTube channel. On the channel, you'll find videos on a range of topics, from casual coffee consumption to politics and current events. In his videos, JP often plays an establishment character, such as the mainstream news anchor or the liberal fact checker, and offers their take on current events. For example, the mainstream news anchor follows an exaggerated establishment narrative about a topic live on camera, but questions it during commercial breaks.
Seriously, do you think they're really going to do the re-education camps for Trump supporters? I mean, they're talking about taking their children from them.
The purpose of JP's videos, and satire in general, is to use humour to criticise powerful people or ideas with the aim of drawing attention to their flaws and shortcomings. JP says this himself in his email newsletter and on an episode of his podcast.
In the video, we portray the logic that these people have, so that you can see how absurd the logic is.
For those of you who aren't familiar with JP's work, there's a simple formula for understanding his videos, which applies most of the time. Whatever a character says, the opposite is what JP actually means.
And I agree. Not only should the government be able to give children hormone blockers and surgically alter their genitals without their parents' consent, I think they should be able to do it without the child's consent either.
This is verbal irony, which forms the bedrock of JP's satire. It's a common device used in the genre, with one well-known example being A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. In the essay, Swift recommends that poor Irish people might ease their economic troubles by selling their children as food to rich gentlemen and ladies. Obviously, Swift doesn't actually recommend this, and instead wrote the essay to mock heartless attitudes towards the poor, as well as British policy towards the Irish in general. An example that looks more like JP's videos is J-Reg's audiovisual experience I Want to Die in a War, in which our protagonist ironically advocates in favour of global warfare in order to attain its side effects, like camaraderie, purpose, and meaning. Things that are hard to find for many in modern society.
There's a really blatant untapped need for some purpose societally. Release pent-up feelings inside of me.
By comparison, there's something different about what JP does. To explain why, I want to present my thoughts and findings from the last few months by showing how JP commits 7 deadly sins, with each sin representing an aspect of his work most people would describe as undesirable, if not outright damaging. That's not to say that JP is without virtue though, and I'll discuss that at the end. For now though, let's get on to the first sin.
There's been a new twist in the COVID crisis.
In New Revelations on the COVID death count, JP posits that 94% of COVID deaths are not legitimate because more than one condition was present in that person at the time of death.
94% of COVID deaths had an average of 2.6 comorbidities. That means of the 161,392 COVID deaths that we've been shoving in your face, only 9,210 were legitimate COVID deaths.
To explain why JP's idea doesn't make sense, let's look at cancer. Cancer on its own doesn't cause death. Cancer kills when it invades vital organs and causes complications. If someone's cancer spreads to blood vessels in the brain, that can cause a stroke, which could be fatal. This person would have had 2 conditions at the time of death. According to JP's logic, this isn't a legitimate cancer death and shouldn't be counted in the cancer death toll. Likewise, it isn't a legitimate stroke death either. To my understanding, most diseases work in a similar way. It's rare for people to die just because they have a virus in their system. They die when that virus causes complications, and they're more at risk of complications and death if they have pre-existing conditions. The CDC keeps a table on their website that shows the frequency of each comorbidity as listed on death certificates in the US. You can see that complications like respiratory failure and pneumonia are very common in cases of COVID-19 where death occurs. Pneumonia, inflammation of the lungs' air sacs, is caused by a pathogen like a virus infecting the lungs. That infection could then limit the lungs' ability to work properly. These aren't separate diseases, they result from a cause, which in this case is likely to be COVID. It doesn't make sense to say that these comorbidities delegitimize a patient's death, as molecular biologist Dr. Wilson explains.
Here's an example of a COVID-19 death certificate. This patient died from respiratory failure and pneumonia, both of which were caused by COVID-19. Even though both of these things are classified as comorbidities, they were caused by COVID-19. And things like respiratory failure and pneumonia are the most common comorbidities listed with COVID deaths. Trying to say that these patients didn't die from COVID-19 is like trying to say that a gunshot victim didn't die from a bullet, they died from blood loss.
So does that mean we've been deceiving you and inflating the COVID death count by 152,182 deaths? Absolutely not, because we genuinely don't believe in math.
I would say JP's proposed alternative of excluding from the death count anyone who wasn't in perfect health until they dropped dead of COVID without warning is more deceptive.
And does this new information that proves that COVID is far less deadly than we've been trying to get you to believe mean you shouldn't live with intense fear anymore? Absolutely not. As your trusted health authorities, we consider our original estimates of over 2 million COVID deaths in the US to be a far more accurate number than the 9,200 deaths that have actually happened.
That 2 million deaths figure comes from an Imperial College London simulation of the worst case scenario for COVID, where there is no social distancing and no lockdown. It wasn't a government estimate, and it certainly wasn't a target like JP seems to imply. If it were true that governments around the world were colluding to control humanity using fear, I'd want JP to show me solid evidence rather than faulty arguments involving comorbidities. He never does provide evidence though. He prefers to take facts and events and distort them, creating a new version of events that suits his narrative. In The Capitol Was Stormed, Everything You Need to Know, JP plays the mainstream news anchor I mentioned earlier and makes liberal use of the next two sins.
Good evening, government property. We'd like to begin by congratulating Nancy Pelosi, who earlier this week banned gendered terms like mother and father from being used in the House.
If JP did some research, or even looked at the headline he included in the video, he would have seen that Pelosi did not ban these terms from being used in the House. She proposed to replace specific words and phrases in the text of the rules. For example, replacing seamen with seafarers, to reflect the fact that not all seafarers are men. Under her proposal, you could still say mother and father and write bills that talk about sons and daughters. Pelosi has not banned these words.
It's a progressive step to help dissolve the loving fabric of families that is so troubling. It's also a much needed and powerful step towards censoring God, as God has used gendered terms like man and woman in the Bible.
Christian scholars have repeatedly changed the word of God in the Bible, even replacing gendered terms with gender-neutral ones. If changing what God said is censorship, then it follows that these rewritings, and in fact all English translations of the Hebrew Old Testament, are guilty of it.
With the admirable left leadership in our country, we can look forward to the evil word of God being progressively eroded away in exchange for the all-loving, omnipresent word of the government, which seems to be more trustworthy than God.
In JP's retelling of this event, Pelosi is trying to dissolve the institutions of the family and Christianity by banning certain words from being used in the House of Representatives. As far as I can tell, Pelosi proposed this change to make the House rules more gender neutral, which also has the effect of no longer excluding the hundreds of millions of Americans who are women or who don't conform to the gender binary.
Congress kicked off with a Missouri representative concluding a prayer with "Amen" and "a woman." As the left insists on banning gendered words, their intellectual superiority compels them to make up new gendered words and use them.
The representative in question is Emanuel Cleaver, a pastor from Missouri, who said his use of "a woman" was a light-hearted pun in recognition of the number of women who will be representing the American people in Congress during this term, as well as in recognition of the first female chaplain of the House of Representatives, whose service commenced this week.
A man and a woman.
Let's see how comedian JP Sears frames this pun.
Ending a prayer with "a woman" is a beautiful, subversive way to spit in the face of God and truth, while honoring Pelosi, lies, and division. This just in! Happy New Year! It's 1984. A Woman will be in the next edition of Newspeak.
Emmanuel Cleaver served as a pastor for over 30 years, so I highly doubt his intention was to spit in the face of God and truth. However, that doesn't stop JP from portraying him as a puppet of the evil left-wing government that wants to take away your freedoms that crops up so often in JP's videos.
In other news, the Georgia Senate runoff election results are in, and the left wins both Senate seats. The left got the most votes in an election. Surprising, right?
A lot of the time, JP just hints that something is up, without actually committing to a statement that can be proven true or false. For example, here JP seems to be hinting that he believes the elections were fraudulent, but he doesn't provide any evidence that we can look at to form our own judgments, except a poll from his Instagram page later in the video, which is hardly a representative sample of the general population.
People viewing the poll, the results are 8% said yes, 92% said no. And there you have it. 92% of people polled agree. Our democracy is under assault.
When a given explanation for an event, for example, the Democrats winning both seats in a close Senate election, invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful groups when other explanations are more probable, there's a name for that. JP peddles the common talking points of many popular conspiracy theories online, like in this next part of the video.
This just in! They can't take away your freedoms if you're brave enough to disobey them. Hey, how the hell did this get in here? And it's written in misgendered ink. I want you to find who did this and put them on AOC's blacklist. They'll be the first to go into the new concentration camps. Oh, but when you find him, tell the public and his family that he caught a virus and needs to be taken away to a FEMA camp for health treatments.
Rumors of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's blacklist come from articles speculating about the meaning of this tweet. Whether you agree or not, this seems quite benign. One thing me and JP do agree on is that the media often uses sensationalism to attract attention.
What do we do with happy news?
Bury it, hide it, burn it.
And what do we do with scary news?
Scream it loud on live TV.
And what?
That's the case with this tweet as well. An article on Politico featured an unnamed White House official saying, "The idea that a sitting member of Congress wants to purge from society and ostracize us should scare the American people." That type of rhetoric is terrifying when you have 70 million Americans who voted for this president. Another article from the New York Post, a veritable bastion of journalism, likens AOC to a fictional Lord High Executioner named Coco, who keeps a list of society's offenders who never would be missed. That is quite literally fear-mongering, something that JP has made videos criticising, although in a different context.
I'm brave enough to live in never-ending terror of a virus.
It's interesting to me that JP repeats the AOC blacklist talking point, because looking at the actual evidence we have, the tweet, there's no indication that she's trying to purge or ostracise anyone. She's not able to enact martial law or order citizens to be rounded up in concentration camps. This offhand comment by JP is a good example of how he will latch onto the things that he reads on social media and parrot them to his audience without checking to see if they're actually true. Which brings us to the fourth sin, good old-fashioned sloth.
Today's top story, President Biden, who's surrounded by Secret Service members with guns to protect him, and who also controls a military heavily armed with guns, wants to take your guns, because guns are bad.
In Gun Control is Here, JP describes his interpretation of the White House's announcement of their intention to produce a model red flag law.
President Biden has signed 6 executive orders on gun control, one of which is the Model Red Flag Law. This executive order allows police and the courts to strip a person of their firearms without evidence or probable cause, and requires the person prove their innocence in order to get them back. That's a big one. I really can't stress that one enough. That's a big one. And it's for your protection.
What a red flag law actually does is allow family members or law enforcement officers to petition a court to temporarily remove an individual's access to firearms when they're in crisis and pose a danger to themselves or others. According to the Associated Press, which JP describes as a terrorist organization, 19 states already have versions of these laws in place, and research shows they can reduce suicides and prevent other forms of gun violence. These red flag laws are well-liked bipartisan proposals. Even well-known Republicans like Lindsey Graham support them. He said in 2019, "I have reached an agreement with Senator Blumenthal to create a federal grant program to assist and encourage states to adopt red flag protection order laws to timely intervene in situations where there's an immediate threat of violence. I spoke with the president this morning about this proposal, and he seems very supportive.
Without evidence or probable cause.
The states that already have red flag laws do require evidence and probable cause, and some of them have penalties for giving false information to a judge. They aren't anything like JP makes them out to be, but that doesn't stop him from making quite a big deal out of this. Directly afterwards, in the same video, he then mentions and repeats an Instagram post by his hunting partner Tim Kennedy, which in turn is taken from a slideshow from 2011, which gives various examples of when gun control was enacted and how it led to genocide.
In 1911, Turkey established gun control, and from 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Armenians were murdered.
Repeating somebody else's points is fine, but you still have to take responsibility for what you say. Some of these historical examples of gun control just don't exist.
In 1935, China established gun control, and from 1948 to 1952, 20 million citizens were systematically killed.
I can find no record of China implementing gun control in 1935. Permit-type systems enacted in 1951 or 1957 do limit gun ownership, but don't line up with JP's theory, since the government had already begun executing landlords and sending dissidents to labour camps before these laws were passed. Later on in The Capitol was stormed, JP finally talks about the storming of the Capitol and says the following.
Conspiracy theorists suggest the most unruly protesters were Antifa in disguise, just trying to wreak havoc to make Trump and all his supporters look like they're dangerous and trying to overthrow democracy.
JP then shows us two of the people who stormed the Capitol as examples of people who are supposedly Antifa in disguise. Antifa is a descriptive term for people who go out and actively oppose fascism from a left-wing perspective. It's not a single organisation. JP, having not done the research himself, thinks Antifa is an organisation, and a criminal one at that.
The charities Antifa and BLM have been busy continuously committing crimes as a way of raising awareness that we need to defund the police. These criminal organizations know better than anyone else that we'd all be better off with no police to stop criminal activity.
So bear in mind, when JP says Antifa in disguise, he means it as if covert operatives have been sent by a criminal organisation to infiltrate the demonstration, to make Trump supporters look, as he says, dangerous.
Well, luckily our fact checkers have debunked this claim as false, citing the latest science that shows Antifa wouldn't dress like this.
This is a fellow called Jake Angeli. He has been present at a number of demonstrations supporting Donald Trump and promoting conspiracy theories such as QAnon, a far-right theory that alleges Satan-worshipping cannibal pedophiles plotted against Trump while he was in office.
The fact checkers also deny that it's even possible the same alleged Antifa member was at a BLM rally in Arizona in June. And here he is pictured at that rally, so you can be certain of what didn't happen according to our fact checkers. And as you can see, socialist media giant Twitter now lets you know through a manipulated media thought control warning that no Antifa activists stormed the Capitol, according to multiple fact checkers. And the fact that Twitter does this doesn't make it any more suspicious.
Here's the full image from the photographer that doesn't crop out the Q sent me sign, referring again to that far-right conspiracy theory. He was counter-protesting this rally, not supporting it. But of course, JP saw the cropped image on Twitter, and that's enough for him.
The fact checkers will also let you know that this Trump supporter is definitely not Antifa. That's why he has the communist hammer and sickle tattooed on his hand, like most Trump supporters do.
The gamers in the audience might have already noticed, but a quick Google search shows that it's not the hammer and sickle, it's the Outsider's mark from the video game Dishonored. So, what JP has done is again hint and imply various things that aren't true, framing these people's participation in the event as a conspiracy by sinister and powerful groups, when other explanations are more probable. And so he hits all four of the sins we've covered so far in about 1 minute of footage. Another example of where JP commits all four sins is his video Big Tech Cleans House, where he talks about the social media site Parler, which was removed from Google and Apple's app stores following the riot at the Capitol.
In other pro-freedom news, Parler, a censorship-free alternative to censorship-heavy Twitter, is under assault. Big Tech demanded that Parler instill the same draconian speech restrictions that users on other platforms suffer under, but Parler refused, saying it believes in free speech.
Something I see a lot with online politics is people confusing the legal concept of freedom of speech in the US with the abstract idea that you should be able to say whatever you like without consequence. Freedom of speech as introduced in the First Amendment means government cannot jail, fine, or impose civil liability on people based on what they say. It does not protect speakers from private individuals or organizations. For example, you can still be sued for defamation. Later in the video, JP mentions that a wrestler is being executed for speaking out against the Iranian government. That's what freedom of speech is meant to prevent. It means you can criticize the government without losing your life or liberty for doing so.
Google took Parler out of the Play Store, followed by Apple taking Parler out of the App Store, and then Amazon, who supplies the servers that Parler uses, kicked Parler off its servers. They took Parler off the internet.
JP makes this sound spooky, but in reality, these private companies are enforcing their right to refuse service to people who break their rules. Here is Apple's statement, explaining why they were removing Parler from their App Store.
We have received numerous complaints regarding objectionable content in your Parler service. Accusations that the Parler app was used to plan, coordinate, and facilitate the illegal activities in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, that led, amongst other things, to loss of life, numerous injuries, and the destruction of property. Our investigation has found that Parler is not effectively moderating and removing content that encourages illegal activity and poses a serious risk to the health and safety of users in direct violation of your own terms of service.
Apple was willing to allow Parler to remain on the App Store, provided that they respond to this message with detailed information about how they intend to moderate and filter this content from their app.
To justify its decision, Apple declared, Parler is in fact responsible for all user-generated content on its service. Now this runs contrary to the same section 230 that says a platform is not responsible for the content generated by its users. The same section 230 that protects Twitter and Facebook. But luckily Apple slammed its $1 trillion judicial hammer down to inform the public of the new law. Parler is responsible for the content generated by its users, while Facebook and Twitter are not. It makes sense when we tell you to think it does.
What Apple is actually saying here is that they're satisfied with Facebook and Twitter's moderation policy, while Parler avoids moderating content that breaks Apple's terms of service. That's the whole selling point of Parler, that it's a free speech platform. Obviously their moderation strategy is going to be less hands-on than Facebook and Twitter. Section 230 means a platform can't be sued for the user-generated content it hosts. For example, Twitter can't be sued for the content of someone's tweet. Apple refusing to host Parler on the App Store because they allowed calls to violence has nothing to do with Section 230's legal protection.
Big Tech's rationalization for crushing its competition was, threats of violence and illegal activity were happening on Parler with respect to the violence at the Capitol. That's a convincing statement, so much so that you're convinced to not realize that Parler doesn't have a groups function, but Facebook does, and Facebook groups were used to organize a lot of the protests at the Capitol.
Again, Apple's problem with Parler is that they weren't moderating their content. Facebook does moderate their content, taking down pages that call for violence. Parler already censors spam and pornography, so it has the ability to detect and remove content from its service. They just don't do it.
And with illegal activity, you also don't realize that Google is then complicit in enormous illegal activity as Gmail is used to pass pedo porn amongst criminals.
This strange tangent actually hurts JP's argument, since Google actually has a system in place for detecting illegal images in Gmail and has reported instances of their exchange to the police. Google is actively moderating the private exchange of illegal material, while Parler isn't moderating public calls to violence on its service. JP tries to paint a narrative that Big Tech wants to get rid of Parler because they're scared of free speech, and he only presents information he incorrectly thinks suit that narrative, using sensationalist terms like draconian speech restrictions and Parler is under assault. You could argue that he is just parodying the way TV news anchors will sensationalize what happens, but to me it seems like he's being earnest, and likes comments that praise JP's videos as being the real news. There are a number of similarities JP's videos share with talk shows on TV news channels like Tucker Carlson Tonight. They both feature one person giving their point of view, and they both mislead their audience and use sensationalism to make money from advertisements.
And what do we do with scary news?
Scream it loud on live TV.
And why do we do this?
Because that's the only way we can make money from advertisements.
You'll remember earlier that JP called the news nonprofit Associated Press a terrorist organization. Let's hear why he does so.
Hamas carried out airstrikes from a building shared with the Associated Press, a fellow terrorist organization. The Associated Press terrorizes people with fear so they're more controllable.
No, JP. You do that. I don't know if you've ever read news from the Associated Press, but it's quite dry. You won't find any sensationalist headlines on there, and it's generally considered to be one of the leading sources of factual news reporting. The webpage certainly sports a different vibe to other more partisan publications. Unlike JP, I'm not going to speculate about any potentially nefarious or selfish motives he might have for spreading fear and misinformation in his audience. I have no evidence for that, and to be honest, I do think he's truly bought into what he's saying. Well, for the most part.
Before you go, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Cacao Bliss. If there's one thing I love as much as freedom of speech, it's cacao.
What I do have evidence for is the reason why JP might be susceptible to believing this stuff, and why he ignores facts and evidence. JP promotes a way of thinking that disregards evidence in favour of what feels right. Take this clip from an episode about JP Sears from the podcast Decoding the Gurus.
What feels true? I want to pay attention to that. What feels untrue? I want to feel that so I can not go in that direction, not open my mouth to those spoons shoveling towards me.
Yeah, that's a perfect illustration, I think, Chris. Yeah, but go ahead.
And a terrible advice for someone. Like, believe what you think feels true and ignore whatever you find hard. Like, that's terrible advice especially in the context of finding out what's true about a global pandemic.
We used to believe illness was caused by miasma, or bad air coming from things that were rotting. But when evidence was found for a new germ theory of illness, the old beliefs were discarded and life expectancy began to rise. People are able to live longer, healthier lives because we adapted our beliefs to new evidence. The idea that bad smells make you sick is more intuitive than the idea that tiny, invisible bugs are responsible for disease. But just because it's more intuitive, that doesn't mean it's true. Intuition, while it's good for things like social situations, is not a good way of thinking about complex, nuanced topics like illness, economics, or politics. The reason I point out these flaws and go through examples of JP's work where he's wrong about things is not an attempt to dunk on him Ben Shapiro style. My aim with this video is to show not just how often JP gets things wrong, but that he builds and spreads a dangerous worldview from it, and he's very confident about what he's saying. I think maybe that's the result of ignoring facts and evidence that contradict what you believe. You don't routinely experience that humbling feeling when you realize you were wrong about something. One thing you might notice if you go through JP's back catalogue is that he focuses on fact checkers a lot, and he promotes the idea that people who try to show you evidence contrary to your beliefs are fascists in the making rather than fellow seekers of truth.
A diversity of ideas is bad for society. It's better if we all think the same way. Probably be better if we all look the same way too. You know, kind of like Hitler's philosophy, except we call it fact-checking.
He also likes to say he loves disagreement.
I love disagreement.
While at the same time framing any sort of criticism of him as unreasonable or emotional.
Now's a great time to discount people that speak of this new information with a well thought out, emotionally charged comment rebutting something they didn't say. Like, oh, so you're saying you don't even care about the people that did die of COVID? You're glad they're dead? You just want sick people to die? Nice video, you far right. You stopped being funny a long time ago. I didn't know I was far right. You're putting everyone's lives at risk with your irresponsible commentary on COVID. Your wife should leave you because you're toxic. Good point. Babe, you should leave me.
Why?
I love how you try to exterminate all thinking, ideas, and people that don't fit your most ideal vision of how the world should be. Hitler would be proud of you.
Now, don't get me wrong, I've had my fair share of strange comments too, but they're a small minority. This presentation of disagreement as hate is a good way to sidestep having to actually engage with the criticism or provide evidence to back up your statements. And it's also a good way to portray yourself as unbiased, which is something JP does a fair amount. For example, in one of his email newsletters, he says, "I am not pro-vax or anti-vax," and then links to an article from a website that is very much anti-vaccine. And in his video, How to be Mind Controlled from 2017, his mind-controlled character says the following.
I want to be heavily vaccinated so I can be protected from the diseases that I've been told to be extremely afraid of.
So it seems to me that he does actually fall on one side of this fence. In another email, he praises the Epoch Times as being an unbiased news source, despite it being the second largest funder of pro-Trump Facebook advertising after the Trump campaign, and not having the most stellar record of factual reporting. It could be that JP thinks he has no political bias, but he echoes a lot of right-wing talking points. Not that that's bad in its own right, I just wish he was upfront with it, rather than taking the Dave Rubin route of presenting yourself as someone who's merely discussing these topics in the free marketplace of ideas. You can't have these kinds of discussions if you're not willing to listen to evidence.
God help us all if everybody thought the way I do.
Probably the worst thing about JP Sears is the fact that he's good at what he does. If you discount the prior sins, he comes across well on camera, he's very popular, and some of his older videos are quite good.
As a life coach, I'm definitely looking forward to getting rich from the latest ebook I've written. It's called How to Get Rich by Writing Ebooks.
He also appears considerate and compassionate in older interviews.
What's your biggest fear?
My biggest fear is losing myself. It really is. There's, I mean, and I know you have a degree of fame and notoriety as well, and my ego scares the crap out of me. And the question is, how do I speak with my family members who are speaking like drones, who are full of jargon with cult-like glazes over their eyes? I just kind of want to really get angry at them, but for now I'm avoiding them. This is tough. Putting myself into your shoes, my family members are brainwashed. They're just like drones regurgitating this jargon. And I'd be sitting there thinking and feeling, where are my family members?
By contrast, now, he seems to have lost some of that compassion. In this clip, he describes Joe Biden as the father of a crack addict, referring to his son Hunter Biden's struggles with addiction.
In other news, while delivering the National Prayer Declaration, the father of a crack addict with underground business dealings in Ukraine and China failed to mention the word God.
The JP Sears of the past would have been, I think, the last person to dehumanize an addict like this. But now it seems like he's so clouded over by this conspiracy stuff, or perhaps by his ego, that he does the opposite of what I imagine an emotional healing coach is supposed to do. He makes a similar comment about Caitlyn Jenner in another video titled "The World is Burning."
Caitlyn, who won the decathlon in the 1976 Olympic Games while pretending to be a man, made her announcement over Twitter.
Where is the calm, kind JP that once was? Maybe his disappearance is the result of fame and attention. There's an interesting video on Facebook hosted by, weirdly, capitalism.com, where JP goes over what ingredients make a video shareable that I think is appropriate here.
Number one is, that helps a video become shareable, is entertainment. Ingredient number two is inspiration. Ingredient number three is awareness. What one of those ingredients absolutely is not is information. Being informative can be very helpful, it can be a great service, but that alone doesn't create shareability in my experience.
Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, JP has become more and more of a misinformer rather than a satirist. I think it's good to push back in whatever way I can against JP and people like him who pump out misinformation and deceit, because there are lots of people paying attention to him, and I don't want him to say things like this and go unchallenged.
I have an important election announcement for you. Take off my face suffocator.
There are people vulnerable to COVID who haven't been able to live their lives or see loved ones for over a year because of people like JP and other offenders who spread fear and misinformation when they have no good reason for doing so. Thanks for watching, and hopefully the next video won't take so long.
Things happen in the world. They're complex. They're hard to predict. They're hard to make sense of. Things like this fill us with doubt. And that, ultimately, I think, is what conspiracy theories help with for some people. They give us clarity. They give us someone to blame. See, doubt is a specter that hangs over all of us. Basically, from the cradle to the grave, it's a burden that we all have to bear as intelligent beings. And oftentimes, especially in today's world where we're being constantly bombarded with reams of conflicting information that we don't know what to do with and can't ever hope to fully comprehend, that weight is too much to carry. While believing that tragedies are caused by a cabal of Jewish space lizards is both insane and terrifying, it also represents a kind of freedom. It's freedom from doubt. And that is why people believe.